Hello everyone, I'm Rick and thanks for joining me. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and liking to help the channel grow. Today we're looking at something very unique, the FiiO K19. And I'd like to thank Apos Audio for sending a unit out for review. The K19 is FiiO's current flagship DAC and headphone amp. On this video, I'll share my opinions as we walk through the unit because there's so much to cover. First, we'll start with orientation. And it looks like FiiO's intentions were for this unit to be mounted in the vertical orientation this way, as there are some screw holes where we can screw in the provided feet. And when in this vertical orientation, the printed text is correct. FiiO does include the screws for these mounting feet as well as the driver, which is a nice touch. But I do think that a missed opportunity was to have this unit with some screw holes drilled on the bottom side so we can use these same feet to mount the unit in this fashion right here. The screw holes could have been countersunk and an extra set of shorter screws could have been provided to act as caps for the unused screw holes. The K19 does get pretty warm, not hot, but definitely warm. And while the K19 is milled beautifully with its honeycomb grid on both sides, when you put the unit flat horizontally, you lose airflow. Now in the box, you do have some rubber feet. The provided silicone feet are gonna give you about a 1/4 inch in this case, but I think a more elegant solution would have been those screw holes to get you something like this. Beautiful casework nonetheless. On the front side, I have to say I think the unit looks very classy with all the lights and the screen off. First we have a cover that hides the 4-pin XLR balanced out, then a 6.35mm single-ended, followed by a 4.4mm Pentagon balanced. Next, a very small OLED screen, followed by USB-C digital in. When you connect to this port, the USB-C digital in on the back side is deactivated. Next, a menu and input encoder, and finally a volume and power encoder. A single short press powers the unit on, and a long press powers the unit off. The encoders have a slight wobble to them, but are super grippy because of the texture on them, which is something I love. My fingers definitely don't slip. On the back side, from the left, HDMI in, followed by an HDMI ARC. Next we have a set of 12-volt triggers, one in and one out, a ground lift switch in case you're picking up some noise, followed by a couple of USB-C ports. The first is labeled RS-232, and this is a COM port that's used to connect this unit to a computer to run its DSP software. And that software is available to download for free on FiiO's webpage. The second USB-C is a digital in. And again, when you have the USB-C on the front side plugged in, this one in the back is deactivated. Next, more digital ins, one on coaxial and one on Toslink optical. And then a head scratcher, a set of digital outs. Again, one on coaxial and the other on Toslink optical. And I really don't get it. I don't know why they gave you these digital outs. The unit doesn't have a built-in streamer and you're paying top dollar for a unit with a good DAC. And I suppose you can use it as a DDC, but there's a problem here. One of the key features of this particular device is its DSP. And it's not just any DSP, but a monster of a DSP. The analog devices chip on this unit is literally double the speed of what many DSP uses in theirs. They use analog device DSPs running at around 400 to 450 megahertz, while this one is running at 800 megahertz, so a ton of horsepower. Of course, mini DSP software is way more robust, but we'll talk about that later. So while the DSP chip in this unit does easy work of all the EQ settings you'd want, those changes are not sent out through the digital outs, and that's a big disappointment right there. The EQ can only be heard on the analog outs. A mini DSP DDRC22D at $800 would be a much better option for DSPing, and is DRAC Live compatible. Next we have our analog outs, 2 sets of RCA and 1 set of balanced XLR, and all 3 do output simultaneously. Very cool if you want to bi-amp plus add a couple of subs. And they can be pre-outs or fixed outs. And finally the power section. You have a barrel connector if you want to bring your own DC power supply. It does require 15 volts at 5 amps, or your IEC connector for your AC power plug. A small toggle lets you choose whether you use the DC or the AC. And I suppose for $1,300, it's a nice to have. Design-wise, I really do like everything about the looks, except for the ring LEDs. I'm personally over RGB anything. It's 2024, not 2018. The K19 comes with a remote control with volume up, volume down, mute. You can scroll through the EQ settings, select your input, turn the lights on and off, as well as 2 programmable function buttons. So let's take a look at the menu. A short press on the power button turns it on. And we go into our input select, USB, coaxial, optical, HDMI, HDMI ARC, Bluetooth, and return. If we hold down the input, we'll get into the menu. And turning the knob counterclockwise goes down. Now this is super annoying at first, but I got used to it within about an hour of using the unit. Although I will say, if FiiO would just make a software update in the firmware to add on in the menu system, just like they have the screen rotation, maybe a encoder reverse, that'd be wonderful. Of course, if FiiO takes into account that we only need to reverse the menu one, as the volume one does work properly. To the right, you increase the volume, to the left, you decrease. But that'd be a nice fix, and I think the next firmware update should definitely include it. Hopefully FiiO is watching and they can implement that as soon as possible. It'll make things a lot easier for everybody. Back to the top. We have the equalizer, and here you can select from 7 options and off, as well as 10 custom presets that we'll get to later on. Next is gain, 5 levels, and I think this should be trimmed down to 3. 5 is just unnecessary. Output select, let us select all of our output options. Max volume setting, this is awesome so you don't blow your eardrums out accidentally. Filter selection, and these are your standard ESS filters. I enjoy the appetizing. Dimmer, 5 steps on the screen dimness. Screen timeout, I have this set for 2 minutes, but you can go from 15 seconds all the way down to 30 minutes. Screen rotation, and you can select any orientation you want. Smart idle time for power savings. You can select whether your trigger ins is active or deactivated. USB audio class, you can switch between UAC 1 and UAC 2. Language, factory reset, version, and update. And finally, the unit ID and return. Finally, to the specs. The K19 uses a pair of ESS Sabre ES9039S Pro chips, capable of handling up to 32-bit 768 kHz and DSD up to DSD 512. The K19 can handle MQA as well. And on the digital outs, you're going to max out at SPDIF speeds 24-bit 192 on PCM and DSD 64. On the Bluetooth side of things, aptX low latency, HD, and adaptive, as well as LDAC. The headphone amp pumps out up to 8 watts of power per channel on the balanced outs, and 1.1 watts on the single-ended at 32 ohms. And FiiO has a ton of specs on their website that I'd encourage you to take a look at if you're looking at this DAC to purchase. So how does it sound? It sounds great. To my ears and on my speaker system, it sounds kind of in between a topping D70 Pro Sabre and a topping D70 Pro Octo. Not as smooth as the Octo, but not as detailed as a Sabre, but in a really nice middle ground, which I very much did enjoy. The bass is controlled and deep, vocals are crisp without being sharp, and the highs do give you a little bit of shimmer. Just slightly more detailed with a little larger soundstage than an X-Duo TA22 when used on its tube mode, but not at the level of a topping D90 Mark III Sabre. As for the headphone amp section, this really isn't my thing. But at this price point, you aren't going to get anything bad. As with everything, at a certain price point, you're at a sufficient performance. That's like comparing the performance of a Ferrari versus Lamborghini. After 200 miles an hour, you're going to be looking at the design aspect to see which one you prefer the most. I found the headphone section to be plenty powerful, but if you need more transparency and even more power, a topping A70 Pro would be a good alternative. Now onto the DSP software. The EQ can be controlled through a tablet or a phone via Bluetooth, or through a computer with the USB-C cable. And they do have different experiences, and I'll show them to you from worst to best. On an iPad, I first turned on Bluetooth, then I added the K19. The iPad found the K19 right away, and it connects pretty quickly. This is the FiiO Control app. On our status screen, here there are just basic settings, nothing like in the K19 menu, which I definitely think could be improved. You do get an on-off toggle for the LEDs, and more lighting settings, which again I didn't use. A section for Bluetooth codecs. You can select your preferred codecs. And finally, input selection. On the bottom of the app, we have access to the EQ. It does take a minute to connect. And here the app shows I have custom EQ1 settings, and this is our standard graphic EQ. The problem with the iPad version of this app is that we have our graphic EQ, but nowhere on here do we see what frequency we're messing with. So you literally have to trial and error to see what frequency you're playing with, because nowhere does it show. If I expand or minimize, the same thing. So this app definitely needs a little more work. Another issue is that there's no reset to 0 button on any of these EQ sliders. So if I want to go back to 0, I have to kind of fidget with it till I get the right EQ. Now up on top, we hit this button to go to the advanced settings where we have our parametric EQ. Here it's much easier. We can slide this slider to see what frequency we want to adjust. So let's say we go to 250. Now we can adjust with the slider. We can adjust our Q as well. Or if we want to change one of the 31 EQ settings, Like in this case, we're at 250, and let's say we want to change 240, we can change this one to 240, and now we can really focus on the frequency we want to adjust. And we can do a peak adjustment, a low shelf, and a high shelf. On the Android version, we get almost the same experience as with the iPad. The same settings on the status screen. However, on the EQ screen, we get the important addition of the frequencies down at the bottom of the sliders, which really does help. Same thing in advanced settings. That takes us to the PEQ. And onto the Windows app. This one is called FiiO Audio DSP. This one takes a few seconds to load, but once it's loaded, the changes are pretty much instant. This off button selects the EQ, and changes can be made with the sliders, by typing it in the fields, or by moving the EQ point. You get a few more features on the computer software. On the upper left, you get an expander, a compressor, and a limiter, which might be useful in studio use. I don't touch these. Then we have an RTA, and in the RTA options, we have sweep and pink noise that can help you tailor the EQ to your particular system or your room, without having to jump into Room EQ Wizard. Here's a demo with the responsiveness of the EQ. And here's where things get really interesting. If FiiO were to develop these apps further, I can see it very capable of doing a DRAC Live style auto room correction. The DSP is definitely up to the task. If you're watching this video a few months after I posted and FiiO has addressed these issues and has updated their apps, then FiiO should be commended. So my conclusion, for an all-in-one, I think the K19 is a solid product. Excellent hardware, although the software isn't very polished and definitely has room to be refined. And that's all I have today. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.